I am Michaela Jones, a senior psychology major from Moss Point, Mississippi. And the chapter I chose is Chapter 3, Suspensions, Corporal Punishment, and Intolerable Zero Tolerance Policies. During the 1970s, slightly more than 2 years apart, the Supreme Court issued two momentous decisions probing constitutional limitations on the ability of public schools to sanction students. First, I'll start by discussing Goss versus Lopez. The court case was decided by Burger Court, argued October 16, 1974, and decided on January 22, 1975. At that time, 9 students at 2 high schools and 1 junior high school in Columbus, Ohio, were given 10-day suspensions from school. The school principals did not hold hearings for the affected students before ordering the suspensions, and Ohio law did not require them to do so. The principal's actions were challenged because parents were not happy. A federal court found that the students' right had been violated. The case was then appealed to the Supreme Court, which is the highest court to take a court case to. The court in Goss versus Lopez delivered a victory to students' rights. It provided that schools could not remove pupils in the form of either suspensions or expulsions without affording them some modest procedural protections. A question proposed is, did the imposition of the suspensions without preliminary hearings violate the students' due process rights guaranteed by the 14th Amendment? And here on the right, we have a graphic that better explains the court case in a funny way. The answer to that question is yes. In a 5-4 decision, the court held that because Ohio had chosen to extend the right to an education to its citizens, it could not withdraw that right on grounds of misconduct absent fundamentally fair procedures to determine whether the misconduct had occurred. The court held that Ohio was constrained to recognize students' entitlements to education as property interests protected by the Due Process Clause that could not be taken away without minimum procedures required by the clause. The court found that students facing suspension should at a minimum be given notice and afforded some kind of hearing. A significance of Goss versus Lopez is that the Supreme Court's decision elevated the salience of school disciplinary procedures, requiring the lagging districts to adopt a minimum level of process and encouraging other districts to afford stronger protections. The second court case my chapter introduced was Ingram versus Wright. It was decided by Burger Court, also argued November 2nd through the 3rd, 1976, and decided on April 19, 1977. On October 1st, 1970, Assistant Principal Solomon Barnes applied corporal punishment to Roosevelt Andrews and 15 other boys in a restroom at Charles R. Drew Junior High School. On October 6, 1970, Principal Willie J. Wright removed James Ingram and several other disruptive students to his office, where he paddled 8 to 10 of them. When Ingram refused to assume a paddling position, Wright administered 20 blows. Ingram's mother later took him to a hospital for treatment, where he was prescribed cold compressed laxatives and pain-killing pills for a hematoma. To conclude this case, in a 5-4 decision written by Justice Lewis Powell, the court held that the 8th Amendment does not prevent corporal punishment in public schools. Justice Powell also held that the 14th Amendment's requirement of procedural due process was satisfied by Florida law. This court case shows significance because the vicious way that Ingram was beaten shifted public opinion against the practice of physically punishing school children. He was spanked so badly he suffered a hematoma that required 11 days of rest. The seeming tensions between these two decisions, issued in a rapid succession, presents one of education law's great constitutional enigmas. Apart from posing an intriguing historical puzzle, though, both Lopez and Ingram continue to reverberate in the modern era. School suspensions and expulsions have escalated dramatically in recent years and have assumed a severe form that would have been difficult to envision as recently as the early 1990s, let alone when the court first addressed the issue more than 4 decades ago. Contrary to popular perception, moreover, public schools within the United States continue to impose corporal punishment on students. Perhaps no arena of education law is there greater need for renewed attention than in assessing how schools sanction wayward students, even though the precise justifications vary in the two contexts. With suspensions and expulsions, the need is great due to the staggering number of students annually removed from school and the ruinous consequences that often accompany such actions. In comparison with their peers, students who are removed from school are more likely to experience not only academic difficulties, but also long-range adverse outcomes, including criminal involvement and incarceration as adults. With corporal punishment, that need is great not due to the sheer number of students who receive corporal punishment, which is infinitesimal when compared with the total number of students attending public schools. Instead, the need for intervention here is great because no governmental practice today more violently contravenes core American ideals than permitting educators to beat their students. This chapter also talked about the zero tolerance policies. Zero tolerance policies are school policies calling for automatic suspension or expulsion of students who bring forbidden items such as drugs or weapons to school or who engage in undesired behavior. The end. Thank you, and I hope you guys enjoyed this slideshow.